I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, in a pale blue colonial house on Willow Street. The shutters were white, the front porch had a swing that squeaked every summer, and the maple tree in the front yard turned gold every October. My father, Thomas, used to say that one day this house would belong to me and my sister. It was meant to be the symbol of family, security, and belonging. My mother, Linda, often filled it with the scent of cinnamon rolls and apple pies, especially on Sundays. Those smells, drifting from the kitchen, always felt like a promise that the house and everything in it were a part of me. I believed in that promise, perhaps more than anything else. Looking back now, I should have known better. It was a gray March afternoon when my father called me into his study. I was 26. The air outside was heavy with mist, and I remember wiping droplets from my coat sleeve as I stepped through the narrow hallway. His study always felt like a courtroom: mahogany shelves, a dark oak desk polished to perfection, and blinds half closed so the light fell in angled stripes. Emily, my older sister, was already there, sitting in the leather chair across from him. Her smile looked triumphant, though she tried to hide it behind a polite expression. On the desk, our family lawyer, Mr. Dorsey, had placed a folder. I thought it might be related to taxes or some neighborhood issue. But when my father slid it across to Emily, I saw the word deed in bold print. My heart sank. "We have transferred the house and all other property to Emily," my father said. His tone was cold, detached, as if he were discussing the weather. He folded his hands and leaned back, satisfied. I blinked. "What? Why?" My voice cracked, and the words came out sharper than I intended. "This is your punishment," he said, as though the decision was final and righteous. "You wanted independence, so you will have it. Earn and eat on your own." The room went silent. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Punishment," I whispered. "Punishment for what?" "For not being grateful," he replied. "For choosing your own path, rather than listening to your family. You have always been stubborn, and now it is time for you to learn." Emily crossed her legs and added smoothly, "It's simpler this way. You always talked about wanting your own life anyway." Her words stung like salt in an open wound. I realized then that everything I had believed about fairness, about family, about promises made in childhood, had just collapsed. They had chosen her, not me. And it wasn't about the property alone. It was about being erased, about being told I did not belong to the very place where I grew up. I left the room without another word. I carried only a paper bag with a few books and, hidden in my coat pocket, the silver brooch my grandmother had given me. It was small, shaped like a leaf, and tarnished from age, but it was the only piece of my family that felt like mine. I stepped onto the street, the cold air biting my face, and headed toward the subway. On the Red Line ride back to Somerville, I stared at my reflection in the scratched glass. I lived in a tiny rented studio apartment. Rent was $1,820 a month. My savings stood at $8,470. My part-time job writing product descriptions for a local furniture startup paid just enough to keep me afloat. I could have wept the entire ride, but instead I clenched my fists. By the time I reached my stop, something inside me had shifted. If my father wanted me to earn and eat on my own, then I would. Not just enough to survive, but enough to thrive without ever needing their approval again. That night, I sat on the edge of my futon as the sun disappeared behind the brick buildings outside. My studio was small, one window, a tiny kitchenette, and a desk that wobbled on one leg. I pulled out my laptop and opened a blank spreadsheet. If my family wanted to strip me of a home, I would build one for myself, through work. Not a house of wood and brick, but one made of determination and skill. I began by listing what I knew. I loved metals. In college, I had spent hours in the jewelry studio, shaping scraps of silver into pendants, melting gold into delicate bands, soldering and polishing until my fingers blistered. I knew e-commerce. I had built websites and learned how to photograph small objects to make them look valuable. I also had the persistence to work until midnight, if that's what it took. At the top of the spreadsheet, I typed Monroe and Light. Beneath it, custom fine jewelry, recycled gold, lab-grown stones. Made in America. The name came from two things. Monroe, my mother's maiden name, which I still cherish despite her silence in that study, and light, which I believed symbolized hope. The next morning I acted. I drove to Worcester and bought a used laser engraver for $3,200 from a jewelry shop that was closing. I registered an LLC for $300. I signed up for an online store platform that costs me $79 a month. I spent $540 on antique ring settings and $260 on packaging materials, boxes, tissue paper, ribbon. My savings shrank quickly, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't for months. By midnight, my website was live. No one knew me. No one believed in me. And yet, as I stared at the glowing screen, I realized I didn't need anyone's permission. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was breathing clean air. When I went to bed that night, the studio smelled faintly of cardboard and metal polish. My laptop hummed softly on the desk. I lay awake, not thinking of my father's cold dismissal or Emily's smug smile, but of the future I would create. I promised myself that I would build something so strong, so undeniable, that one day, when they saw me again, they would not recognize the woman they had cast aside. That was the day I was erased. But it was also the day I began to write my own story. The first sale came quietly, almost like a whisper of encouragement from the universe. It was in May, about 3 weeks after I launched my little online store. A nurse from Providence named Mia ordered a simple pendant, a small silver disc with a hand-engraved star at the center. The piece sold for $190. I remember staring at the order confirmation, my hands trembling over the keyboard. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the fact that someone, a stranger who didn't know my story, had chosen my work. They trusted me to create something meaningful for them. When Mia received her package, she left a review that stopped me in my tracks. She uploaded 3 photos of herself wearing the pendant, one in scrubs, one at a cafe, and one holding her niece. She wrote, "It feels like someone listened to the story in my head and gave a shape I could wear." Her words lit a fire in me. For the first time since being cut off from my family, I felt like I was building something real, something that could stand on its own. 2 days later, an email arrived from a small bridal boutique in Boston's South End. They had seen Mia's post on social media and wanted to know if I could design custom wedding bands for 6 couples. The order totaled $12,000. I read the email at least 10 times before believing it was real. I didn't even own enough equipment to handle the order at once, but I told them yes. For 3 weeks, I worked late into the night in my studio, the hum of the laser engraver filling the silence. I packed each ring with care, polished it until my fingers hurt, and shipped it on time. When the check arrived, I taped it to the wall above my sink. Every morning, while sipping instant coffee, I looked at it as proof that my dream wasn't foolish. The momentum pushed me forward. My landlord noticed the noise from my engraver and, instead of complaining, offered me the basement for free if I fixed the broken shelves and kept things tidy. That basement, dark and musty, became my first workshop. I scrubbed the floors, set up a long work table, and strung up brighter lights. The air smelled of metal polish, cardboard, and determination. One afternoon, I met Daniel, a freelance photographer who lived 2 doors down. I showed him my pieces, and he offered to photograph them in exchange for a necklace for his girlfriend's birthday. The trade turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I ever made. His photos made my jewelry look alive, the way the stones caught light like morning sun over the Charles River. Those images helped me land my next wave of customers. By month 4, I needed help. That's when Mia, the nurse who had bought my first pendant, reached out again. She confessed she was ready for a career change, tired of night shifts and the exhaustion that never lifted. When I told her I couldn't afford much, her reply was simple: "I believe in what you're building." I hired her part-time at $22 an hour. She learned quickly, polishing, packaging, handling emails, and speaking with brides who swung between joy and panic as their wedding days approached. Together, we were like a 2-person orchestra in that basement. The heater clanked through the winter, and in the summer, a rattling fan kept us from melting. We laughed, we cursed when shipments were delayed, and we celebrated every order as though it were our first. By the end of that year, Monroe and Light had grown far beyond my fragile hopes. We had sold 148 pieces in total. Revenue reached $168,400, and after expenses, I had cleared $41,900 in profit. It was enough to give me confidence, and enough to dream a little bigger. I upgraded the engraver for $5,600 and invested $1,200 in a sturdy safe. I no longer feared losing everything in one accident. The biggest leap came when I signed a lease on a tiny corner space in Back Bay. The rent was $3,900 a month, an amount that made my stomach twist, but when I first walked in, I knew it was worth the risk. The space had exposed brick walls, tall windows that flooded the room with light, and a stubborn front door that only closed with a hip bump. It was imperfect, but it was mine. Mia and I painted the walls soft white, assembled display cases, and placed a single walnut table at the center. The night before opening, I sat on the floor surrounded by packaging tape and tissue paper, wondering if anyone would even come. The fear was suffocating. But the very next morning, a couple visiting from Vermont walked in. They admired the rings, whispered to each other, and within an hour, purchased 3 stackable bands for $2,250. I wrapped their purchase with trembling hands, then excused myself to the bathroom, where I cried quietly. Tears of relief, joy, disbelief, all of it mixed. I splashed cold water on my face, looked in the mirror, and whispered, "You're doing it." I walked back out, smiled at Mia, and went straight back to work. From that moment on, everything felt different. I no longer saw myself as a girl cast out of her father's house. I was a business owner, carving out a place for myself in a city that didn't know my past. My father's words, "Earn and eat on your own," no longer felt like a punishment. They had become the fire beneath my feet. And though my parents and Emily still hadn't called, hadn't checked in, hadn't shown a single flicker of interest in my life, I didn't need them. Every ring, every necklace, every satisfied customer was its own kind of family, its own kind of home. That first spark, the pendant, the nurse, the review that read like a hug, was enough to remind me that sometimes being erased is the only way you discover who you truly are. Year 2 of Monroe and Light was the year everything accelerated. The basement workshop that once smelled of metal polish and cardboard had become too small for the orders flooding in. We had crossed $600,000 in revenue and cleared $180,000 in profit. For the first time, I paid myself a steady salary of $64,000. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to cover rent, groceries, and the tiny luxuries I used to deny myself: a cappuccino at the cafe on Newberry Street, a proper winter coat, even a short weekend trip to Portland, Maine, where I walked along the wharf and promised myself that one day I'd buy a cottage by the sea. In year 3, Monroe and Light grew even faster. Orders poured in not just from Boston but from customers in Chicago, Denver, and even London. By December, we had crossed $1.8 million in revenue with $420,000 in profit. Each time I looked at the books, I felt both pride and fear. Pride that I had built something real. Fear that it could all vanish if I stumbled. Friends told me it would be safer to stay small, to avoid the risks that come with expansion. But deep inside, I knew I wanted more. I wanted permanence. That's when I met Angela, a quiet realtor with sharp eyes and a soft voice. She walked me down Newberry Street one afternoon and stopped in front of a narrow storefront. The building had wrought iron railings, a carved stone lintel, and a bay window that looked like it had witnessed 100 Boston winters. She handed me the listing sheet. $2.2 million. The number made my stomach flip, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The echo of my footsteps on the wood floor, the smell of plaster and dust, the way light pooled through the bay window. It was like holding a finished ring in my hands and knowing it was meant to be worn for a lifetime. I negotiated hard, leaning on everything I had learned about persistence. After several tense meetings, the The price came down to $2.14 million, with the promise that I could close quickly. I put down 30%, $642,000, drawn from retained earnings, and secured the rest through an SBA 7(a) loan at 7.1% interest. The day I signed the papers and turned the key in the front door, my hands shook with the same mix of terror and triumph I felt when my first customer placed an order years before. Inside, we began to build. The showroom took shape at the front, all glass cases and warm walnut displays. Behind it, we carved out a workshop, 2 benches, 1 casting station, proper ventilation, and a rule that phones stayed in drawers while we worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. I hired Luis, a setter with steady hands and kind eyes, at $72,000 a year. His craftsmanship was flawless, and he could coax even the most stubborn stone into its place. For sales, I brought in Ava, a sharp and intuitive woman who understood people as much as she understood jewelry. I offered her $58,000 plus commission. Mia, who had been with me from almost the beginning, became operations manager at $85,000. Watching her step into leadership was like watching a younger version of myself finally allowed to flourish. To mark our expansion, I placed a bold order. A shipment of vintage platinum settings from a trusted dealer in London, costing £48,000. When the crates arrived, I ran my thumb along the mill-grain edges, feeling the weight of choices made decades ago by craftsmen long gone. Those settings would carry new stories now, stories of commitment, love, and endurance. By the end of year 4, our numbers were staggering compared to where I'd started. $3.6 million in revenue and $820,000 in net profit. Those figures gave me something I had once believed was beyond me: options. I bought a small brick townhouse in Cambridge for $1.12 million, putting 20% down. The kitchen window overlooked a sugar maple that glowed gold in October. Every morning, I drink coffee there, staring out at the tree, and remind myself how far I had come from that night on my futon in Somerville. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, almost impulsively, I purchased 2 more properties. A warehouse condo in Providence for $540,000, perfect for storing metals, equipment, and archives. And a weathered cottage on the Maine coast for $420,000. The cottage smelled of pine and salt, the kind of place where the waves could drown out all noise. I wrote each address carefully in a leather notebook and underlined it twice. These weren't just buildings, they were proof of independence, proof that I could carve permanence out of nothing. And yet, even with all the success, a shadow lingered. I did not call my parents. They did not call me. I heard through an old neighbor that Emily had moved into the Willow Street house with her fiancé, Mark, after my parents had placed the title in her name. I was told the house now had new shutters and a manicured lawn courtesy of a service. Every time I passed that neighborhood on my way into Boston, I felt a sting in my chest, like a bruise that never quite healed. But I didn't stop. I let the news drift through me like a leaf carried by the river. My work became a promise I made to myself, a vow that I would not measure my worth by their acceptance. I would measure it by every order fulfilled, every customer who walked out of my store with something that made them glow, and every brick I laid down in this new life I had built. Success had given me a shield, but it also gave me clarity. I no longer needed to fight for their approval. I no longer needed their house or their inheritance. I was building a legacy of my own, one purchase, one property, one ring at a time. What I didn't know then was that this foundation, brick, gold, and paper, was not just for me. It was preparing me for the day when my past would come walking right through my own front door, forcing me to face the family who had once erased me. 5 years to the month after my father told me to earn and eat on your own, I found myself standing outside my Newbury Street store with James, our head of security. The autumn air carried a crispness that hinted winter was not far behind. Delivery trucks moved slowly down the narrow street, brakes squealing as drivers double-parked for a few minutes to unload crates. James, dressed in his usual navy blazer, checked the clipboard in his hand as I read through the shipping manifests with him. I wore a black blazer, jeans, and my grandmother's silver brooch pinned to my lapel. That brooch had become my quiet shield, a reminder of where I had come from, and proof that I had carried at least one piece of family love with me into this new life. I was just about to sign off on a package when I heard my name called out. My body stiffened before my mind caught up. Turning, I saw them. My parents. My father's hair was whiter now, his face a little more lined, but his posture was still as straight as it had been the day he banished me. My mother stood next to him, her expression pinched into the familiar look she used to wear when my grades weren't good enough. Emily was with them too, her hand looped around a designer purse, wearing cream sweater I recognized from old Christmas photos. They stopped in front of me as though I were a stranger occupying a place they had intended to claim. My mother tilted her head toward the store window, where a new display glimmered under the lights, 3 engagement bands in platinum and rose gold. She frowned, the same way she used to frown at my report cards when a grade wasn't perfect. "Do you work as a cleaner here?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with sharpness. "If you do, could you ask the owner if we can come in early? We would like to look at rings for Emily." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened as if invisible hands were pressing against it. But before I could find words, James answered. His voice was calm, steady, and carried no doubt. "No, ma'am," he said. "She is the owner." The silence that followed stretched out like a drawn bow. A delivery truck idled noisily nearby, but even its rumble seemed far away. A woman in a pink scarf paused mid-step on the sidewalk, sensing the tension in the air. My father's mouth opened slightly as though words had abandoned him. Emily's hand tightened around her purse strap, her knuckles turning pale. My mother's face froze in place, stiff like ice forming on a gutter in December. I lifted my key card slowly. "Welcome to Monroe and Light," I said evenly. "We open in 3 minutes. You are welcome to browse." My father finally found his voice. "You cannot be serious. This place is yours." "It is," I said. "We started in a basement with a space heater. Now, we serve people from Boston to London. You told me to earn and eat on my own. I did." My voice stayed soft, though my heart pounded in my chest. I refused to let it shake. Emily forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We were only curious. We heard you had a little shop." James, ever steady, held the door open. "After you," he said firmly. They hesitated but stepped inside. The store smelled faintly of cedar polish and fresh flowers. Sunlight poured through the bay window, pooling onto the glass cases. Ava, our sales lead, glanced up from the far side of the showroom. When she saw me, she gave a subtle thumbs up before turning back to polish a display. I guided my parents and Emily to the engagement bands, speaking to them exactly as I would to any other clients. I explained the difference between alloys, showed them the precision of prong work, and described the craftsmanship behind each piece. I pulled out a platinum setting from the London shipment, letting the light catch the mill-grain edges, and a rose gold band crafted in our own workshop the week before. "How much are these?" my mother asked, her face still locked in its tight mask. "For the pair," I said clearly, "the total is $14,600 before tax." The number hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Emily glanced at her parents, but no one spoke. For a moment, it felt like the ground beneath us was uneven, like they had stepped into a world they couldn't control. When Emily stepped aside to answer a phone call, my father leaned closer. His voice dropped to a low murmur. "We made choices," he said. "It was for the best." I met his gaze, unflinching. "For the best for you," I replied. "But I am fine either way. I built my own house. I built my own door. And I will decide who walks through it." For the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes. When he looked at the brooch on my lapel, I caught a glimpse of the father who used to push me on the porch swing until I squealed with laughter. But just as quickly, the look vanished, replaced by the same cold detachment I had seen in his study years ago. They did not buy a ring that day. They left with careful, deliberate steps, their faces as frozen as when they had first walked in. After the door clicked shut, James let out a quiet exhale. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," I said. Let's get back to the delivery list. That evening, I went home to my townhouse in Cambridge. The maple tree outside the kitchen window glowed gold in the fading light. I made myself a cup of tea and set the silver brooch on the counter. Then I opened my leather notebook where I kept a record of my addresses and milestones. Beneath the last entry, I wrote a new line: I am the owner of my story. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me unclench. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was my mother's. My heart quickened as I opened it, but inside, there was no apology. Instead, it was a request: help with the cost of repairing the roof at the Willow Street house. I sat for a long time staring at the letter. The old me might have crumpled it in anger or wept over the audacity of it. But the woman I had become took a deep breath, turned to a fresh page in my notebook, and began drafting a reply. I offered them a loan at market rate, 7.5%, with a simple contract and a repayment schedule secured against the new shutters and the lawn service accounts. My tone was professional, polite, and firm. There was no anger in my words, only clarity. If they wanted a bridge, I would build it, but it would be made of paper, numbers, and mutual respect. When the letter was finished, I signed my name in steady ink, folded it carefully, and sealed the envelope. As I walked it down to the corner mailbox, the evening smelled of coffee and rain. I paused outside Monroe and Light and glanced at the reflection in the bay glass window. The woman looking back was not a cleaner, not a guest, not an outsider. She was the owner.